Keeping in line with our topic next, which is a contentious one for many South Africans, 2.1 million people are in need of housing in South Africa. But someone who can provide us with more insights on that and perhaps how the new government might have to address this issue is Stuart Wilson. He's an Executive Director for Socio-Economic Rights Institute, from that institute. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stuart.
Thanks very much.
Many people not only queuing in line to cast their ballots today, but many people have been in queues for a long time to get their homes according to the RDP plan. But unfortunately, delivery hasn't taken place.
Yeah.
Or at a slow pace.
Perhaps we should just start with the statistics. It's an off-quoted statistic that 3.3 million houses have been built since 1994. We just don't know that. What we know is 3.3 million housing subsidies have been allocated. And of course, that's a different thing. We don't know, and the national government and no level of government is able to tell us how many of those subsidies have been translated into bricks and mortar on land that has been allocated to beneficiaries. Now, of course, it's a lot. Well over 1 million, I would say, maybe approaching 2 million. But when a housing subsidy is allocated, it's given to the provincial government, who then allocate it to a specific beneficiary on a database. Then the houses have to be built. And before the houses can be built, land has to be allocated. Services have to be put in. A contractor has to be retained to build the houses. And during that process, a lot can go wrong. There can be mistakes on the database. People who shouldn't get houses do get houses. There can be fraud in the process. The land just might not be available or suitable for development. The contractor may abscond. The housing project may be locked. There's a concept of locked and blocked housing projects out there where something's gone wrong in the process. The subsidies have been allocated, but the houses haven't actually been built. So we don't know. The 3.3 million figure is accurate to say, to represent how many housing subsidies have been allocated, how much money the government has allocated. And that obviously shows that the government takes its obligations in this respect seriously. But we simply don't have the data to say how many houses there are.
What I'm hearing, Stuart, is that the allocation and delivery process is in itself not transparent, and this is sounding like perhaps the key issue. How do we then move towards a space which is more transparent, where we can have a clear process as to when the subsidy is originated to the end beneficiary? Well,
we need to do two things. We need, first of all, to take the process of housing allocation as far as possible out of the hands of the bureaucracy and put it in the hands of local people. And we need to, secondly, respond to the needs as they exist on the ground. The vast majority of the housing allocation activity that's going on out there is putting lots of houses side by side on greenfield sites at the periphery of our major cities. Bureaucrats are in control of that land, they're in control of the housing that gets allocated on that land, and the entire process from start to finish is a bureaucratic process. And it leads to the provision of houses far away, often from job opportunities, substandard houses, because contractors don't always do, as we all know, contractors don't always do what they're supposed to do, sometimes leads to substandard houses, and houses that don't reflect the needs of the people to whom they're supposed to be allocated. And we need to move away from that. We need to start providing land to start with. This obsession with bricks and mortar is a little bit misdirected. What most people need after apartheid, a system that allocated 80% of the population of our country to 13% of the land. What we actually need is secure tenure for most people. We can do bricks and mortar later, but most people in this country need access to service land more than they need access to bricks and mortar.
And you mentioned something so poignant there, because there's still a mentality that, Nozipho, if there's a vacant land open anywhere, that I feel I'm entitled to this land. I take my pick and shovel, demarcate my area there, and myself and my colleagues or whoever else decide to start up a new township based on shacks. It does seem as though the communication is not made from the authorities to the people out there, that the land needs to be serviced, proper infrastructure planning, as well as town planning, basic town planning, as you mentioned. So it does seem as though there is some kind of backlog with regard to communication.
Gugu, what you have to be careful with there is, this isn't a question of entitlement, this is a question of desperate need. We have a history in this country of the vast majority of people being allocated to a tiny minority of the land. What did we think was going to happen at the end of apartheid? Of course, that massive pressure cooker of land occupation was going to lead to people in desperate need of somewhere to be, because we all need somewhere to be, simply going onto land that appears to be unoccupied and making a home there. What else are they supposed to do?
We have Stuart Wilson, Executive Director at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute, with us here in studio, taking on the housing legacy in the past 20 years. Stuart, when we left, before we went to break, we were talking about the land policy and how that is so important to make sure that it enables the housing policy. We've got two pieces of legislation. From where you sit, do you see these two pieces of legislation speaking to each other?
Well, land redistribution isn't proceeding at the pace that it should. The government's own targets haven't been met. All three spheres of government, national, provincial and local, seem to find it very difficult to make land available, well-located land available to poor people for the purposes of housing. Very often at a local level, the policies simply aren't in place to do that. And you have municipalities claiming that there's no land available, but there are no mechanisms, there are no budgets, there's no planning in place to ensure that land that is there and vacant is procured by the state for the purposes of low-cost housing. And obviously there are trade-offs. If somebody wants to build a big commercial mall on a piece of well-located land, there's a lot more money in that for anybody involved than there is in allocating it for very, very poor people. And those kinds of choices, which are often based on class and the value that you assign to having a nice big commercial mall versus a low-cost housing project, often come into it. But we simply don't have an appropriate land allocation policy.
So how do we sort that out?
Well, we need to start compulsorily purchasing a great deal of well-located land and allocating it not only to RDP housing, which, as I've suggested, takes a long time to deliver, but also to service sites. As I said earlier, what very poor people, a rapidly urbanizing population, very, very poor people come from rural areas into urban areas in the search of any job, the lowest paid job that they could possibly that they would possibly find or accept. Is better than what they get in rural areas. They're looking for services and they're looking for a place to stay. And our municipalities are currently in denial about that. They're in denial about urbanization, where people occupy land through their own initiative. They get evicted, often without a court order, but they're not going to go away. It's like sitting on the beach and telling the tide not to come in. You just can't do that. You've got to cater for the demand created by urbanization. So we need lots of open land. We need municipalities to start making pro-poor choices about how that land is going to be used. And we need it to be made available on often a very, very simple basis. Service sites where people can perhaps construct their own rudimentary shelter, but where they'll be secure. Because very often people move to urban areas, they fulfill essential economic roles. They're petrol pump attendants, they clean and guard buildings, but the money that they're paid is less than the cost of living in urban areas.
Exactly.
So who's going to pick up the tab? It's got to be the state, and it's got to be the state with land.
Stuart, we must address the elephant in the room, and this is, of course, the issue of the lists. We see these lists being drawn up by different groups with different political agendas, and I think this is the root cause of the corruption and the fraud that we see in the allocation of housing. How do we fix that?
I could sit here for another 3 hours and talk to you about that, but very, very simply, the first thing that we need to appreciate is that the list is a list for access to permanent housing, for a bricks and mortar house on a site that the beneficiary will own. That isn't the only or even the major need at the moment in the housing, in urban housing delivery, in the urban housing delivery sector. What I've said is people need interim access to land and basic services. So just concentrating on the list and just concentrating on RDP housing isn't going to make a difference to the vast majority of very, very poor people, some of whom have been waiting since 1995 for an RDP house on the so-called waiting list. So we need to bear that in mind. Delivery of permanent housing is one small part of the problem. But to focus in on that, the way that you deal with the RDP delivery problem is to put control of who obtains permanent housing and who obtains land ownership in the hands of local communities insofar as possible. The more that it's a bureaucratic process, the more that it's a technical process, the more that
So you're saying
can go wrong.
decentralization is going to turn out to be a faster solution?
Well, it's already happening. In Durban and in Cape Town, and to some extent in Johannesburg, there's a move away from having a list of beneficiaries and then moving them all to a greenfield site on the urban periphery, towards upgrading people where they are, towards consulting people about in situ informal settlement upgrades, and bringing housing policy back to the control of local communities. Unfortunately, the idea that there's this one big waiting list where everybody's got a number like at a delicatessen and they just have to sit and wait until their number's called, that's already outdated. That's already a myth. There is no one housing waiting list. There are lots and lots of different lists that respond to a range of different local priorities.
But we still have Stuart Wilson. Guess who's on my mind today? He's Executive Director at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute. He's still with us here in studio. Stuart, perhaps if we pick up on the use of data for politicking, it's something that the numbers do seem to confuse. The ANC says 3.3 million homes have been provided. In an earlier message, we said 2.1 million individuals were still without homes. It does seem as though there's no clear indication as to what the true numbers reveal.
There simply isn't, Gugu. Just to take the statistic that was given earlier, 2.1 million people still in need of housing in this country. Well, let's think about that for a minute. About 50 million people in South Africa. If there are only 2.1 million people in need of housing, that means about 95% of us are already adequately housed and therefore not in need of housing. And I think you just have to look around to see that that isn't true. Now, there's the old saying, lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's not so much a case of lying. It's a case of not having the data available. From what we can tell, there are maybe 7 million people living in informal settlements in this country. So that's probably a good start to look at effective demand. But very often people aren't captured in the demand databases until they urbanize. So people move from rural areas into urban areas in search of economic opportunity. And when they were living in a rural area, they weren't captured as requiring a house. Maybe they hadn't registered on the RDP database. Maybe they just hadn't been captured for some or other reason. They move into urban areas and they're immediately in need of accommodation because urban areas are set up effectively and have been historically to exclude poor people in this country. And suddenly you've got effective demand. So nobody really knows what the statistics are, and the statistics are obviously a moving target. That doesn't make the task of providing land and housing for people who need it impossible. It just means that you need to be a little bit more sophisticated and responsive and go to the need where it exists. Not rely on a centralized, so much on a centralized bureaucratic process. Rather go to communities and respond to the need where it actually exists.
There is one particular eyesore that stands out for me, and then this is when I look at the Western Cape, and I in particular look at the N2 Gateway project that has been spoken about so much. Here's an issue for me that doesn't seem to be talked about often enough. Why is the Western Cape government not focusing on this very, very key housing issue in your view?
Well, the N2 Gateway project is a case in point. There's an informal settlement sitting there, a group of informal settlements, one of which is called the Joe Slovo informal settlement. Why are people living there? Well, they're on the N2, aren't they? You nip onto a tributary road onto the N2, and in 5 minutes you're in the centre of Cape Town, and you're pumping your petrol, you're cleaning and guarding your building, you're informally trading, you're engaging in the range of economic opportunities that cities present for poor people. When the decision to upgrade the N2 Gateway project was made, it was made in a way that didn't identify the objective need that existed on the ground. The plan for the N2 Gateway project was to provide rental housing that nobody could afford, and to relocate the Joe Slovo informal settlement to somewhere near Delft. Which is about 15 kilometers further out from Cape Town and much, much further away from economic opportunities. And a lot of the people in Joe Slovo were faced with the very real possibility that the cost of getting into the Cape Town was going to exceed their monthly income. So there was a great deal of protest against that. The case eventually went to the Constitutional Court, which on very stringent conditions decided that the relocation could go ahead. But then the provincial and the national government realized that they couldn't meet all the conditions that had been set by the Constitutional Court, and then decided to reassess the idea of upgrading people in situ. So at the moment, what you're beginning to see in the N2 Gateway project is actual housing delivery in response to the objective needs that exist. We've wasted a lot of time trying to force people to accept solutions that don't work for them. But the N2 Gateway project is one area where the state is actually belatedly beginning to respond to the needs that exist and upgrade the informal settlement in situ. But it's an isolated example in a sea of need.
Well,
remember that when the EFF began its campaign, we saw them building a house just outside Nkandla, trying to send a very strong political message there. And we've also seen in past elections, whether it's been at a national or provincial level, where the ANC and other parties have tried to use housing as draw cards to particular voters. Is this not an instance where, as South Africa, we've sort of missed the blind spot, where we've had state resources being used for party political mandates, and we haven't seemed to be piggybacking on this, and we're not talking about it?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to assume that suddenly things get done because an election is approaching. I would take it as quite a positive thing if suddenly a year before an election millions of people got houses, but that's not the way it works. The delivery of housing is subject to all of the constraints that we've been discussing in the last hour or so. I did hear from a fairly senior official in the national government recently that he's been put under a great deal of pressure to show ministers projects and new initiatives that they can complete and cut the ribbon on in public in the run-up to the election. And there is that tension between party and state, between any party, frankly, even if the EFF was in power, and it happens all over the world. There is that tension between party and state. The ministers from a particular political party, when the elections are approaching, want to be seen to be out there cutting the ribbon on a new initiative that's going to solve everybody's problems. It's not going to happen. These things, while there's obviously a tension there between party and state, and a potential criticism that the line between party and state is being blurred, it's not going to solve anybody's problems. It's substantially cosmetic. And the business of delivery of land and housing is something that's far more complicated and can't be resolved in the run-up to an election. But you make a point worth considering there, Nozipho. The EFF's construction of a house next to Nkandla, or I assume it wasn't a house that we would call a house, or some sort of shack next to Nkandla, created a very powerful image for most people. There you have the national government spending hundreds of millions of rand on the president's security and comfort. Nobody would dispute that the president is entitled to a degree of security and comfort. Everybody is. But you hear in the segment that we've just had now, a local councillor saying there's no money, there's no resources, there's no alternative accommodation. When people see Nkandla next to a claim like that, they quite justifiably get upset. They quite justifiably get emotional.
Blood pressure goes up?
My blood pressure goes up when I hear stuff like that, because the money is there. Johannesburg municipality runs a 4.5 billion rand budget surplus. It regularly spends less than it is allocated by national government for social provision. You also have broader allocative decisions made by the state. For example, the comfort of the president versus social programs. And the idea that the money isn't there is simply a misnomer. The resources are there, the money's there. Very often the political will isn't. South Africa has the world's 29th largest economy. It has an economy roughly the same size of Serbia's. Serbia's poverty rate is 1%, ours is approaching 40%. It's not a question of resources, it's a question of prioritizing who we want to be as a nation, and whether or not we're serious about looking after the poorest and the most vulnerable in our society.
You mentioned something so poignant there, because again, the comparison of Ngandla compared to an RDP home, the quality of the homes is also something that's in question here. People mentioned leaking roofs on a day-to-day basis, cracked walls. It does seem as though the government, if they can't do this alone, why not involve the private sector perhaps?
Well, a lot of the housing that's leaking and cracked is built by the private sector. In fact, almost all of it. RDP housing is substantially delivered through contractors. And the contractors are the ones doing the shoddy job. We've all had experiences with contractors doing shoddy jobs. What we need to see is more of a concentration on providing people with land and services, and the resources and the means necessary to make a home for themselves. Very often, if you see, there's a project just outside Johannesburg called the Sepi Song project. It's not particularly well located, but there you see people who've just been allocated land and services, and they've built houses for themselves, sometimes with government subsidies, sometimes through their own effort. And the reason why housing is so emotional in this country isn't really anything to do with housing or the quality of bricks and mortar. It's got everything to do with access to land, the right to exist, the right to be a South African, and the right to be an urban South African, which for so long was denied the vast majority of people in this country. That's why it's emotional.
Stuart, how do we regulate the leasing of some of these RDP houses, which has become such common practice amongst those who have been beneficiaries?
Well, I think when you find someone who's been given a well-located house that's close to economic opportunity, they're a lot less likely to lease it or move away to somewhere else than they are if they're given a house on the urban periphery far away from economic opportunity. Very often the informal sale and leasing of RDP houses is a function of their distance, their disconnect from real economic opportunity in urban areas. But there's one school of thought that says, well, if you give somebody a house, you give them an asset, and they ought to be able to use that asset as they see fit. Even if you accept that, you've got to accept that the provision of an asset isn't the only thing that you need to solve the housing backlog. The one big thing we're missing, apart from rapid land release in this country, is a large-scale, affordable, low-cost public rental housing policy. There are hardly any public rental housing units available at an affordable rate across our major cities. And very often the need to stay in a particular place for very, very poor people is temporary. They move with a job, they move with economic opportunities. And in that case, rental housing at an affordable rate might be a better solution for the mobile poor, if you like, than a static, permanent house on the urban periphery. Of course, people will take what they can get.